Prosperity in Black America. What will this require? Is Black business prospering? Are we reaching women and minority-owned businesses? How do we achieve earning parity for wealth for our families? Do our children really have access to education? Will our families have choices for our children? Prison pipelines, mass incarceration, tearing our families apart. A healthcare system not accessible to the masses. The disproportionate termination of Black women from corporate America. When will we actually begin to address what's really at play? How do Black people gain more power to help make these changes? This requires a lot of political will and courage. I'm that provocateur of change. I am Cindi Bright. Welcome to HeartBeat. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to HeartBeat. I'm your host, Cindi Bright. Thank you for joining us this evening. We're competing with NBA basketball playoffs tonight, so hopefully you've chosen HeartBeat over the Knicks just won. But thank you for joining us because we have an important conversation this evening. I had titled the show this evening that we wanted to talk about the Office of Superintendent for Public Instruction, the chief educator here in the state of Washington. We are going to talk about the fact that it's election time. Filing deadline is this Friday. We have invited two guests on with us this evening to have that conversation, who both have filed to run for that seat against the current incumbent. One has pulled out one of the race, but he is here with us tonight. So we're going to get to talk to him about his decision to join that race and his decision to pull out. We want to talk about what's happening here in Washington State, about whether that the current incumbent, Chris Reichdal, I think that's how you say his name, whether he's been effective from our perspective, whether our children are being served under his leadership. And Reid Saaris is running against him, but Reid had to pull out at the last minute tonight, so we'll get him on in the future. But I just wanted to set the stage for that we do have one of the candidates on with us tonight. Before I introduce in my co-host, we're going to talk about what's happening in our schools, not just here in Washington State, but what's happening across the country, what our children are being subjected to, what our educators are being subjected to. Did you catch what's going on in Mississippi here the last couple of days? Let's show a clip about what is happening here. Did you see the monkey chanting towards the Black student? Do you think that's only in Mississippi? You think progressive Washington State is not dealing with any of these issues? Let's welcome in our co-host with me this evening, Dr. Stefani Coverson. She's here with us every week. Hi, Steph. How are you this evening?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. Thank you. Let's welcome in Erin Jones also, who is our educator here, co-host here every week. Before we invite in our guests, you both saw that clip. Erin, I know you have a lot to say about this. In fact, we both probably do. I do want to talk more about that, about what's happening inside of Washington State schools when it comes to racism and what our kids are being exposed to. Let's start there before we talk about the position that's coming, that's being not vacated, but competed against for the superintendent role. Erin, I kind of wanted to start with you because I know you've had a rough week. You shared some of the things that you have personally been experiencing with our students, but do you want to talk to a little bit with just, I don't know, the last 72 hours has borne for you?
Well, I'll go back one more day than that, 24 more hours. So on Saturday, I host every first Saturday, we host a walk. It's called Walk with Erin that we do in Tumwater from our cultural center, because back in 2020, the week after the election, I was followed in my neighborhood by a small white child, probably about 8 years old, with a toy gun for 3 blocks. And even after engaging with him positively as a teacher would, said, "Hey, little man, please put that toy gun down." I came back about an hour later to talk to his mom, and she, first of all, accused me of being a racist for even talking with them about him having a toy gun. Meanwhile, he's a white child, and my children, I would never allow them to have a gun because I knew my big black boys, if they ever dared pull a gun on a person, even a toy gun, all hell would break loose. I went very kindly to this mom and said, "Hey, your son just followed me for 3 blocks." Um, she first accused me of calling them racist, and then she said, "Do you even live in this neighborhood?" And I've lived in the same house for 15 years. We live 6 houses away from them. I had at that point walked by their house every single day from the pandemic all the way through November. So I don't know how you don't see the 6 foot tall black lady with the big red afro, but she literally, that's what she said. And I looked her in the face and said, "Have a great day." I knew that day we were not going to get anywhere. And so we decided as a community to walk every first Saturday. And we've been walking every first Saturday since January of 2021. This last Saturday when we walked, and we walked, I think there were 7 of us on Saturday, two older black men, myself, and 4 white women. We were called the N-word 3 times by a man hanging out of a truck. So there was a 4-door, big, massive 4x4 F-150 truck, and this man hung out of the door behind the driver's seat and just screamed the N-word at us 3 times and just drove off. And but it felt like I'd been punched in the face. That's how it felt. But here's what it immediately made me think, is I've been visiting schools here in Oregon and California for the last 3 months, dealing with children who are being called the N-word all across our state, up and down the I-5 corridor, progressive, Washington State, Oregon, California. I have spent so much time in buildings with children who are being called the N-word, with children who are being called monkeys. Yes, monkeys. Our children, our babies, starting in 3rd grade. So I'm talking the children as young as 3rd grade who are being called monkeys in their schools. And I think about how I still feel today at 52, almost 53, after that experience. And I think about, no wonder our babies are struggling in school right now. If that's what they're walking through in the hallways and on playgrounds and in the cafeteria, no wonder our children are struggling to learn. No wonder our children don't want to be in school. And and so it was my physical reminder that the work I do and other people like me do, the work that Vincent, who you're going to get to meet, does, is so important, even and especially right now, and even and especially in the face of this anti-DEI movement. The work that I do around DEI is exactly to eliminate these kinds of things. And for people to say we don't need this right now, that's BS.
Yeah. I'm so sorry that happened to you and your walking group. And to your point, I really feel like it is a backlash, right? People are feeling emboldened um, due to this, these attempts at reversity and trying to dial back these efforts. I'm actually also seeing Black mothers and parents posting videos of interactions that their children, like 1st graders, like young kids,
Babies.
babies, having these experiences. Um, and it reminds me of one particular post that I saw of a little Black girl telling a story of basically being microaggressed all day, right? So
Yes,
being
I saw that.
called, did you see
Yeah.
that? The
Mm-hmm.
Black Widow,
Yeah.
you're a monkey. Um,
She was about
and
9 years old. I think she was
yeah,
9 years
just like
old.
a little baby.
Mm-hmm.
And every time she would report it to the teacher automatically took this white student's side and just said, "Oh, he didn't mean it like that. Oh, he didn't mean it like that," and never had a conversation with the little boy to see, in fact, did he not mean it like that? And two, to take the opportunity just to educate the little boy to knock it off. And so how are our students supposed to learn? How are our children supposed to learn? And how are our children supposed to trust teachers and administrators to be impartial, and quote, impartial, and actually lean into these conversations and educate these students or hold them accountable, like if they keep doing it. So it was heart wrenching. And for me, I could feel myself really being activated. Like my daughter is 27 now, and I felt like I was up at the school constantly about racism.
Yeah, I have a little theory about this that I'll share a quick story. You know, I go into schools when there's been an incident, and usually it's when the incident has made the newspaper or it's being called out in some public way. That's usually when I get called into schools. And more than most times, 95% of the time, it's a white administrator. And that white administrator knows that students shouldn't do it, but doesn't understand why kids can't just get over a word. And I have this theory that especially because most administrators in schools are white men, I'd be curious what Vincent thinks about this too later. But because most administrators are white men, there's not a word in the English language that one could say to a white man that would feel like being called a monkey or the N word. There's not a word in the English language. And so I think even for really kind hearted, well meaning white leaders, I think it's way too easy to brush it off and to say, just ignore it. It'll go away. Because for them, there's no incident in which they would feel that kind of fear or lack of security. And so here's what my husband said. I was dealing with this probably 6 months ago, and he said, honey, next time you're in a meeting with a male principal, I want you to say this. So, can I come in and call your wife the B word? And see how he responds, and then say, I need you to have that same energy for these babies. Because how you feel right now about your wife being called the B word is exactly how I need you to feel about these babies being called the N word or monkeys. And I really do think if white administrators are not in relationship with Black folks and don't ever have to feel that, it is so easy to just distance it as white noise and it's just a word. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me, because there's not a word for them that really feels the same way.
Let's bring in, while we're talking, I would love to hear Vincent's feedback about this also. Welcome to HeartBeat, Vincent. Thank you for joining us tonight to have this conversation for our audience. Well, Vincent, I'm going to let you introduce yourself, the candidacy, about why you had decided to run for this spot, and then ultimately why you're not, and then we'll dive into some of these other things. But go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Vincent Perez. I'm the co-founder with my wife, Kim Janssen, and executive director of the Equity Institute, and also was a very recent candidate for the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction here in Washington State. I have recently, actually, because filing is this week, I decided not to file and suspended my campaign and to fully endorse Reid Saaris. Erin Jones had brought us together, and we'd done a few collaborative events and then spoken, one-on-one and together, and realized, well, from the beginning, how aligned our platforms were, really looking at behavioral health in schools, infrastructure, and racial equity, and equity, for all students in the civil rights office, that needing some growth areas in terms of what OSPI can be and do.
Thank you for joining us tonight. You're hearing what Erin and we talk about many different issues every week, but we've been focusing a lot on education because of what our kids are going through, and now we have the public instruction superintendent position opening up. Well, not opening up. I'm sure he's refiling. I assume he is. It's always,
Yes.
most of them want to hold on to that power. I don't know much about him. Vincent, you had decided to initially you were thinking about running, what prompted you to want to challenge him for that seat? Most of our audience knows Erin ran for that seat in, was it 2016? 16, 15?
16.
Yeah, 16. Okay. And so I know, Erin, you had some views about what is needed for leadership here in the state of Washington in that seat. What's happening from your perspective, or what's not happening with that, the leader in that seat? And why do you feel like we need to replace him?
Well, in line with this conversation, I mean, part of my calling to run is that our children are not well for so many levels. Working with different schools and student focus groups, you're talking here about a particular like racist force at children daily. And students say this, right? High school, middle school, daily experiences, but also targeting queer students, targeting trans, body shaming, outright sexual harassment, and so the day, and this is just in the last few weeks, just last Friday, working with an after-school program and an educator talking about a 5-year-old student, a young European-American white student, using the N-word constantly and trying, for weeks trying to address talking with parents. And he claims to have an N card. This is like somehow, 5. And addressing dehumanizing language is part of my career and work. Recently worked with a small school district here in Washington State, whose administration is really taking this on. But the students are very clearly, they're not well, they're not safe. And I had a group of 8th graders, a little over 100. We looked at a bunch of definitions, and we even left out the isms, but we just basic intimidation, harassment, bullying, exactly what are these experiences, slurs, hate speech, what is this, just to define. And I do a fist to a 5, and the students are like this in the front. And there were 5, about 3/4 said it's a 5, and there's 4s. About 5, 6 students said, no, there's zero problem here. And they happen to be white boys. And so this is just pure observation. So for me, that invites like, who's getting taught what?
Mm-hmm.
And do either of you have knowledge of, I assume the superintendent is getting complaints from parents. Do we have insight about, like, is he addressing any issues with these families? Is he not? Do we consider him to be failing in this role? Like, what's the general view about his performance? Because he's been in that seat for quite a while now, right? 8 years?
8 years. 8
Yeah.
years. So here's what I would say. I think he's a good guy. I think what he's not, though, is an activist. And here's what I mean by that. I think it's really easy to allow things to happen in your state based on the legislature. So what a lot of people don't understand is parents would never call OSPI because that's not the function of OSPI. OSPI is the pass-through for dollars in legislation. So really the formal function of OSPI is you manage all the state dollars, and all of the federal dollars go through your, and the basic job of a state superintendent is to make sure all those dollars go through. However, you can use that platform to activate people. You can use that platform to make sure that students are safe, or that you could have a perspective that you begin to use your leverage for. And that's just not who he is. And he's been really clear about that from the beginning, that he was going to be a bureaucrat. That's what he said, even during the campaign. That's been his role. He was a state legislator before this. And so, again, I think he's a good guy, but I think what we need now is not just a good guy, right? We need somebody who's going to really get active around this stuff. We need somebody who's actually going to be in school spaces. One of the things I love about Reid and Vincent is that they are in school spaces often, kind of like I am in school spaces. In fact, I can't tell you the number of people when I go into a school building who ask me how it is to be the state superintendent, because they've never met our state superintendent. They know I ran, and they know I'm in buildings all the time. So they assume that I'm the elected person, even though I was not elected. So I think there's there's a challenge right now because I think our state superintendent is not in both. He doesn't know what's happening other than what people tell him. There's not a clear connection to what's happening for students and what's happening for teachers. And I think this is what I love about Vincent so much. I've known Vincent for over 10 years, and Vincent has done the work of kids and community. And I think what we need right now in a leadership role, our kids are not well, but if you don't know the children, how do you serve them well? Right. And so we need people who are willing to be on the ground, who actually know children, who are around our communities, especially those communities that are not just going to show up to testify in the legislature. And guess what? Black and brown families aren't going to do that. Vincent has been serving in our incarcerated youth for so long. Vincent does that on his own time. He serves the children that we've often thrown away. And I think those are the voices that we need to hear from. They could teach us so much about what could be done more effectively for schools. And so I think we need somebody in this role who is not just going to sit and take whatever's given to them and turn it into law. It needs to be somebody who's going to go and fight in the legislature and say, no, this is not good enough. This is what we need. Okay, so maybe technically you're funding schools, but you're not fully funding schools. We need somebody who's going to go and fight. And this is where I really believe we need a shift. And I believe that Vincent and Reid, both of them, and I know Vincent is technically out now, but I'm hoping that Vincent and Reid will stick together and do this work together. That's really my dream.
You know, what I was going through my head when you were just talking, Erin, is I guess the question in my mind was, what options do we have for our kids? Because, initially when you were first talking, the story you were telling about, knocking on the parents' door and, they don't want to hear it, or we watch in the national news that the trials are now being permanently delayed. Like, there are the demographic of folks that are just literally never held accountable. Like, I guess my question is, why would we believe that anything is actually going to change inside of these schools when, why would we believe it's going to change, right? Like, we're the progressive state. So I don't know. What options do we have with our kids what if right call wins again and we don't have the advocacy at that level, or somebody who's going to, boots on the ground and get to A, know the students, and B, administer discipline to more than just Black children, right? Like, if they're not willing to do that, what should we as a community do? What should we as voters do? Like, what are your thoughts about that?
Vincent, I want to pass the baton to you because I know you have thought about this, and I know we have talked about this before, but I want to give that to you. I have lots to say, but I'd love to hear what you are thinking about this.
Thank you. Well, for me to contextualize that, we all inherited, right, these systems. Nobody asked, like, all of us are born into this, but that perpetuation is up to us, right? And so education, like, I don't know a more important institution. Like, it's the soul of democracy, and without and our young people, even in these small districts I serve, are much more diverse. Like, we don't have to try to be diverse. We already are. To be inclusive, that's the work, right? So, inviting students to engage with all of the different kinds of folks across a globally connected world, right? This is part of why I was running, right? Is we have to have innovation. We cannot continue to do things the way we've been doing for over 100 years, in the same kind of rote memory, sit down in rows. Like, we've got to shift, and that's true innovation. I think about the last 100 years and all that's come, and what is going to happen, and how is K-12 public ed serving those students to deal with this, name it, immigration crisis, climate crisis, mass shootings, cybersecurity, right? They have to problem solve some major issues compounded that they're inheriting that we actually did not. And so equity is part of that equation. It has to be. How can it not be? The students are globally connected. They know what's happening in Gaza. They know where their morals are, their values are, and our institutions are not keeping up. They just lag too far behind. And I will say, as a candidate, and Erin, I'm sure you have also been approached for folks who are not getting solutions or justice through ombudsman or the civil rights office at OSPI, right? There's actually there's some levers I think to be pulled in terms of the bureaucratic system. I've got calls from a parent with a trans youth in another small community in Washington State who's been through over 3 years of just trying to navigate this system and get justice, and they just pulled their child out for their safety.
And where is that child now?
Homeschooling.
Homeschooling.
Which works for some people, but it doesn't work for folks who have to work or folks who don't speak English, or, I mean, there's just so many. And so, to your other point, Cindi, what do we do now? First of all, I think everyone needs to vote. So one of the things that I realized when I ran for OSPI, even though I won almost 1.5 million votes, so many people left that spot blank because they just didn't know what OSPI was and didn't think it mattered to them. And so my ask of our community is do your research. Do your research on that candidate. And I would say at this point, it's Reid, Saaris, or Chris Reichdahl. Do your research, please. Get on their website. And here's the thing that I invited people to do when I ran, and I would say, I know Reid personally. I know this will be true for him. Call them. Call them. I put my phone number out, and I answered every call that people made to me, and I answered actual questions from people. So even though I lost that race by 1 point, I didn't lose it because I didn't talk to people. I lost that race because he had a whole political system behind him and just other things out of my control. But I think we need to care enough to call the candidates and actually ask them the questions that we need answered and hold people's feet to the fire. So if you're not happy with an answer, ask another question. If you're not happy with an answer, call the other candidate. And so I would invite you all, get on all of their social media, see what they're posting about, see what they care about, do your research. And even if you don't have children, schools are raising the next generation of children. You should care about what's happening in our public schools. The other thing that I would encourage people to do, make sure you are paying attention to your school board races, because even more important almost than our state superintendent, our school boards are actually writing policy for schools even more than our state superintendent. So what is happening in your local community with your school boards matters. And just for those of you who don't know, there are big Republican conservative think tanks. And I am not anti-Republican, but I want you to be aware, there are big think tanks with millions of dollars that are moving in from outside of our state to raise up candidates to run for school boards in the state of Washington. People from outside of our state coming in with a bunch of money to raise up people. Pay attention to that. Pay attention to that and watch who is funding people. It's really important to know where the money comes from and look back and see, okay, this person says they're Republican, but who's funding them? This person says they're Democrat, who's actually funding their election? And we need to make sure that people who actually live in our communities are funding the people that are actually working in our communities, and that it's not some outside force coming in with their own ideas about how public schools should work. So you need to care about the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, but you also need to care about your school boards. And if you really care about schools, show up at a school board meeting. And most all of them now you can show up via Zoom, so you don't have to physically go. But please show up and pay attention to what's happening in your schools.
I would also add to get involved if there's a parent organization, because like the PTA wields a lot of power and also winds up talking to the school board as well. And so that is a great way to find out what is happening behind the scenes. It is a great way to evaluate where the power centers lie and the most influential people and administrators and teachers, to really kind of help folks get a lay of the land, so to speak, as well as I tended to find that students where there was not family, some sort of family involvement, many times those students would be the ones that were targeted um, for, whether it be bullying, whether it be disproportionate punishment. Um, so show your faces, and if you have a student in your life, right, regardless of if you are a parent, an aunt, a mentor, um, show your face. Let folks know that we pull up.
And I'm going to add something to this conversation too. Um, Erin and I have somewhat opposing views on this particular topic, but she knows I'm going to go there. She knows. But our children should have choices also, right? And so I've had I've had kids on this show talking to us and parents who have been through everything that you, Vincent and Erin are talking about. So I'm very pro public education, and I'm very pro Black charter schools. And so having choices for our children, you heard that in my intro, right? Do we have choices for our children? Because if we're not, I don't, I'm concerned. I mean, every day in the news, you can see that there's just no accountability from folks. And I just don't personally believe that
Hmm.
we hold these people to their feet to the fire. And look, y'all all know this. I come out of business where, the folks that get away with everything all look the same. The people who can break the rules all look the same. And so at some point, something's got to be different. Like, you just can't keep feeding the same system and keep believing that at one day it's actually going to change. I don't, unless we have bold leaders, we can get bold people in. Now, if he gets replaced and we get a bold leader in, and that leader has to go up against a lot of stuff, maybe, but it takes a whole system to move itself together. One person can't fix a system that's been in place forever. So, there are options here in Washington State, and I believe that those schools should be funded at, I don't know if they are funded at the same level of which public education is, but if our kids are being abused, if we're paying tax dollars for our kids to go in and be abused and not graduate or not be prepared for the world, I have a WTF moment. Like, why would we fund it? Like, why do we keep, so that's my thing, is that I just think we need options for our kids, right? A mom doesn't want to send her child out the door every day knowing that, was it you telling us the story about the kindergartner? Maybe it was the mom that I had on about a kindergartner being handcuffed, like a Black student, but the white students can run around and use language and bully, and we pat Johnny on the head and say, oh, that's just WTF.
Yeah. I think it's also important to remember that the election is just step one, right? So if we get a transformational superintendent for public instruction, like, we've got to support that person. So we're writing our legislators, we're writing, our senators, we're writing the governor's office, we're doing all of those things. Because sometimes what tends to happen is when we elect people, we don't necessarily follow up and say yes or no, do this. And other people who may not have necessarily elected that person are now in that person's ear. And so then some of the promises or statements that were made during the campaign is shifted because they are now hearing from different constituents. And they're not going to necessarily know, like, this person in my ear or these people in my ear didn't vote for me, right? So mailing off that ballot is just step one. So we have got to monitor, support, correct, right? If we see things going off course of what was, promised in campaign speeches, we've got to do more than just cast a ballot.
That's a good point. Are there school districts here in Washington State that are worse than others that you think need almost, yeah? What are you
Okay,
able to?
I don't want to name them because both of us are doing work in school districts, so I'm not trying to
Okay.
name school districts.
Okay.
But here's what I will tell you, though. Here's what I will tell you. When it comes to Black and brown children, this has been my personal experience. Schools that are right on the edge of urban centers are struggling the most. So school districts where they are still majority white, but they have enough Black and brown children that it's not just 2 or 3. Those are the ones right now that are struggling the hardest. It's like this crisis of identity. So and what's happened is because of the housing prices in Seattle, what you're seeing is all these brown families being pushed out of King County into South King County, then pushed out of South King County into Pierce, then pushed down to Thurston County, then pushed down to Lewis. I mean, it's all of this. And so you have a number of school districts that have never had students of color in them. Their teachers aren't trained in how to even think about supporting those students differently. Those communities tend to be more politically conservative and socially conservative. And so this is where we're seeing the trans and queer slurs as well. I think also with the just politics have raised up this, I say often when I'm talking to staff in these small suburban rural districts that Trump, I'm not anti-Republican, but I am anti-Trump. I think as an educator, what Trump has done, and I hold him responsible for this because he was the leader of the country. So I believe he bears greater responsibility for this, but he has incentivized dehumanizing people. He has incentivized that. So everywhere he goes, every speech that he gives, he dehumanizes a group of people, whether that happens to be immigrants, whether that happens to be trans people, whether that happens to be, I mean, pick a group of people that he doesn't like that day. He uses this really dehumanizing language about communities. And because he's the leader of the Republican Party right now, what has happened now is that language has been made viable and almost celebrated. And so what's happening, what I'm seeing, this is just Erin Jones. I haven't done research on this, but I've been in enough rural communities lately. I don't think we're more racist than we've ever been. But I think what's happened is, especially young kids, first of all, they don't have filters. So what they do is they just parrot whatever they've seen and heard. So they're just parroting stuff. So I don't even think a lot of these kids actually believe Black people are monkeys. And I don't think they actually believe it, but they've seen a grown person with a lot of status say those things, whether that's Trump or Charlie Kirk or Elon Musk. They've seen some really, really famous people with big followings say those things. And so that gets incentivized. And here's where I struggle as an educator and a mom and a former administrator. Here's what's so awful about this and insidious. Guess who gets punished? The little white kids who actually don't even know any better yet are the ones being punished. But who actually should we hold responsible? The adults that have initiated that behavior. And I think that's the thing that breaks my heart most is we do have to hold these white children accountable in schools for saying the horrible things. But what makes me really upset is they are going home to places where either mom and dad are saying that thing, or uncle or grandpa or whoever, or their parents are at least listening to that stuff on the news and kids are hearing it. And so what is really hard about education right now for me is that I can go in and talk to kids in a school, I can train teachers, but I can't go home with them. And so I feel like we're fighting this kind of uphill battle right now.
I think it's important to recognize that Trump didn't get into office by himself.
Oh, absolutely.
And so
absolutely.
Donald Trump was very clear about who he was, and where he was going to grab people, and
Yes.
who were criminals and rapists, and Muslim bans, and full page ads about the Central Park Five.
Yep.
And people came out and voted for him. And so I don't hold Trump accountable in the sense that he did this by himself.
No, I
People
agree with you.
voted for him,
Yeah.
and he is pandering to the people who voted for him. And there were people that said, that they don't believe these bigoted things and still voted for him because of business needs or tax cuts or, whatever the rationale is. But still, the problem is that they still supported this person and emboldened this person. And I would also say that as somebody that was grew up being like one Black person in a classroom in, the South King County area, those kids absolutely knew what they were saying to me. Every time they jumped me on the playground, every time they called me on the N word. And I would also say what tends to happen is it's typically the bullied children that wind up getting in trouble, because when that teacher or administrator turns around, they
Who they see.
see the Black or brown or queer or trans student having enough and striking back. And so I think, to be honest, that we underestimate how unkind and bigoted children can be. And it's awful to have to sit with that, right? Because they weren't created in a vacuum. Like, they just didn't jump out of, the womb knowing these things. They were taught, and they know how ugly that is. And so as somebody who experienced it, I knew it was wrong as the recipient of it, in third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade, sixth grade. I knew it. And so I know that they did too. And so they all need to
Vincent,
be held accountable.
no, absolutely. I just wish we could also hold the parents accountable.
Them too. Mm-hmm.
Which we can't right now. But Vincent, I'm curious, you grew up on the east side of the state. I'm curious about your experience coming up.
I grew up calling
in
myself
school.
Mexican, but I now identify as Chicano, right? And that's education that does that. Though I think also that in terms of our context, where I do have hope is that I think these are I think we got 30 solid years of like the vestiges of white supremacy culture, like clasping on to these last, that to me is the representation of somebody like Trump, right? To make America great again, like some kind of past, this before time when over half of our children in Washington State are students of color. When we are a globally connected world and the demographic shift is here. And I think, there's this fear, right, of the great replacement theory or some kind of concept, but we're all, I saw a part of another show where you said your grandchild is like just multi-ethnic from all over the globe. And isn't this the future of the globe, right? And so that's why now, to me, in terms of what OSPI can do and shift in these days, right, especially under a potential Trump administration. I was just thinking about that just this week, and I messaged Erin about it, that what does it mean to be in this context and to have students raised in a school system? And I fear the privatization, like kind of lean into charter, which is for me a slippery slope into privatization, because the far right wants that and they want this segregation. And so for me, yeah, public ed isn't living up to its promise, but the alternative is far worse in my understanding and thinking, right? And I do have a curiosity about pre-Brown versus Board, that how many hundreds, tens of thousands of Black educators were just like cycling out of the system?
38,000
when there was like
educators, yeah.
Excellence and an academic identity is being developed for entire generations of students, right, in Black schools. And so I think this pendulum that swings back and forth in history is really critical right now, and that's part of what we're dealing with. But if we don't teach into the behavior that we expect, then we get what we inherit.
Yeah. And I would say accountability too, right? Because I think there have been a lot of trainings, a lot of conversation, a lot of discussion. And I think right now we're still in a place where many uh, school districts are treating this still as nice to have versus some accountability for using the tools and strategies that you, Erin and Vincent, go into these school districts and other folks doing this work. There's, I think, a lack of accountability for actually leaning into these tools and using the tools that are being provided for folks to put in their tool belts.
And that's another thing people don't understand about OSPI as well, is there is no accountability. So OSPI has no teeth. It has no teeth.
what?
It has no teeth.
Oh,
So
teeth.
so
Okay.
to Stephanie's point about accountability, first of all, there is now a law that requires all educators in the state of Washington and all school boards have culturally responsive training. So every staff member has to have a certain number of hours on average per year, which is lovely. It's lovely in theory. However, they can pick and choose what they want to do. And then there's absolutely zero accountability for that, right? So to Stephanie's point, there needs to be some sort of accountability. And what I have seen far too often, and this is year 33 in schools for me, having sat at the state superintendent's office as the assistant state superintendent, one of the things that hit me really hard in my first year on cabinet was we gather state test scores every year. So kids are in testing right now. So they get about anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks of testing, which for me is it's criminal. I think, especially when we're already losing time in the summer, I feel like state testing is just not giving us what we need. But here's more importantly why we gather those state test results, but we don't do anything with them. So it's almost like, so if I, as a 4th grade teacher, got the test results for my next year's class, so let's say that kids took a test in 3rd grade, I get them in 4th grade, and I see that all of my children are reading at a 1st grade level, but I've never had training in how to move kids from a 1st grade level to a 3rd grade level. Having those test scores is actually not useful for me. If I'm a 10th grade teacher and I know that most of my children are reading at a 6th grade level, that doesn't help me if I've had no training in how to bring them from 6th grade. And guess what? There is no 10th grade teacher that has been trained in how to teach reading, because children are supposed to already know how to read by the time they get to 10th grade. My husband's a high school teacher. The number of kids that he's seeing right now who can't write 2 sentences together, who can't write a paragraph, but part of that is because of the pandemic, and they just never had they missed that background. We got to start where kids are, and state testing is a great way to waste money on something that's actually not helping us get better. So I would love to see our state, in terms of holding people accountable, let's hold people accountable for something that we can actually help them get better at. I think there's nothing worse than punishing people for bad test scores when we haven't even given them the tools for improving student learning.
Teachers have lost time with each other to collaborate, to really, a lot of educators feel isolated. And so that's legislation, that's policy, that's budget line items. That to me is this role of position, right? So there's local control, but the state has that power. And so of about 60% of a school district's budget. So I think that's where those investments and decisions do have to be made and do have to be bold, to give educators time with each other, which means what? It means more teachers, so that they have more time to really do what they love to do. And I have a lot of critiques of the system, and I also have a lot of love for thousands of educators that I know that are in it for all the reasons that people get called to education. They are focusing on the empowerment of every student that they come across.
Vincent, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm about to. Because what I'm sitting here processing while you're all talking is, we've talked on several shows about, we were talking about the Utah basketball team and how they got subjected to the racial and name calling and so forth. And, we were discussing as a group here about, I mean, I'm vocal about leadership, right? That you shouldn't even be in a leadership position if you don't know how to relate to or talk with or identify with or teach about people who are different than you. And the statistics that you were citing earlier around the global majority is here it is. I've cited some statistics on voting power here in the country, that the research that has been done, the shift is here. And so, in order to affect these kind of changes that we need to have requires, valiant leadership and different type of thinking, which means we have to get people in into these positions that have these positions of power. We need people like you in these positions. So I'm asking, what made you pull out? Because we need, many of us do a lot of work behind the scenes trying to help get people interested in politics. And they stick one toe in and see how nasty it is and decide that they don't even want their nail in. in but, why did you decide to not run, and what can we do to encourage, if you're not interested in this position, are there other ways that we can get you into a position of influence? Because we need the voice, we need the leadership. We, depending on the folks who are going to be left in these seats, we still produce the same results.
Yeah. I founded La Cima Bilingual Leadership 20 years ago, right? Part of me, I wrote an essay 20 years ago called Latino Youth, right? The Next Great American Story. Like I'm a realist and I'm a dreamer, right? And we need Erin there too. And we need, look, to me, this is a movement, right? And I do, endorse Reid Saaris because I think he understands that as well as a white man, right? And he understands his privilege and can name it. But what it comes down to is money, right? This is new to me, right? I'm a Puerto Chicano kid who is all up in the system, right? From, I'll be doing Sweat Lodge on Monday with my students who are incarcerated, who have so many lessons and stories to share about what kind of reform is required, right? And so, as immigrants, La Cima serving thousands of undocumented students throughout the last 20 years, right? I know the stories of students and families, and my own, right, who are navigating these systems, who are both being liberated by it and like tormented by it, right? It's for some, it's a simultaneous endeavor, and for many, it's only the negative side of that. And in really joining forces with Reid, I feel like I can still meet my calling for institutional impact without the positionality. But as the only man of color who was in the race, and all men, again noted, so now there will only be white men in the race, there'll be a handful. I'm highly aware of my positionality, and also my representation and it's a very hard decision, but the top two go to the November election.
Right.
And it's political calculus. It's trust in Erin and Reid to come together as a movement. It's, a real belief that if not now, when, right? In terms of educational renaissance, we need a renaissance in education, right? Not reform. We need whole entire shifts. And there's a lot of educators ready to experiment in all kinds of different ways and really pull us out of, again, as you mentioned, right? It's not doing well. There's a lot of critiques.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How can the schools system or districts push back against, I think there's an anti-intellectualism movement, particularly around higher ed specifically, but I feel like that spills into K-12. And so how do we push back against that?
That's a great question.
I've
I
asked
think-
students, I'm sorry,
Oh, go ahead. No, you go ahead, Vincent.
For the last 20 years, I've been asking Latinx students, can you tell us about your family's educational history and what it means to you? And I know it's a loaded question because on average, I've been, again, thousands of students in La Chispa La Cima programs, probably about a 6th grade level of education if students have immigrated. Even my own, who 3rd generation. And so the next piece of that message is that education does not equal intelligence. Schooling has nothing to do with how smart you are. Like, you are already smart. School can be an empowering place to hone and focus your skills and your knowledge and do the things you really love to do and make a living, right? Doing that well. And that's why I believe in it. It's like, it really is a pathway for that emancipatory kind of liberatory experience. And that becomes with developing an academic identity. I didn't really start reading until sophomore year in college to really find the power of the written word. It was W.E.B. Du Bois, Double Consciousness, that like opened me, right? And then I finally had this kind of like, I'm smart. How did it take me until my sophomore year in college to realize I was an academic, right? And so in all the programs that I serve, that's part of what we harness the heart, right? You've got to believe that I can. Once you teach I can, well, we can do anything, right? Engage the body. And even in these talk about, I lean into Resma Minicum's work a lot in terms of like what's passed down in our bodies. And without addressing our nervous systems and what we inherit on all kinds of familial and ancestral levels, we have to be really healing centered. That's the spaces, learning environments at Co-Create. And I know this can happen in public schools because I'm with the educators who do this every day. And then activate the mind, right? But without the first two, you can't really get to that last, right? So that to me is how I approach my, opportunities to serve young people and adults and adult learners as well, right, in the system.
But I heard that question as that is the basis of the pushback for like the DEI, right? Like, we're running out of time, so I don't have time to break it all down. But Stefani, is that how you meant it when you asked that question about like the pushback for intellectualism, because groups of people have now exceeded the bar that was set forth to brown and black people, has met and exceeded. Now the people who set the bar don't meet the bar. And so they're fighting back now against the people who have now achieved and surpassed that. Is that how you were asking the question?
That could be, the root cause of it, but I just think that there's really this sort of anti-intellectualism, anti-education movement, where sometimes folks who, have an interest in education, learning, brilliant minds, are admonished for that, and just this idea that any intellectual discourse or education is stupid and unnecessary, and just sort of this anti-critical thinking, and just discourse, debate, just kind of all the things. And so while it's, I think, focused in higher ed, I see some of the reverberations in K-12 and just this, being an intellectualist is stupid. Education is stupid. Who needs education, kind of thing.
What kind?
Well, I think that's why every speech I do is about that. It gets back to being smart is awesome. And talking about hard things is really critical. If we could teach one skill in schools, it would be critical thinking. One skill. And that doesn't mean you agree with the teacher. It doesn't mean you agree with each other. But I think the one skill that we all need is how to think critically about things. And so I think whether, like yesterday, I was talking to the parole officers for the International Parole Conference. And I talked about that, the importance of being an intellectual, the importance of learning how to think about the way you think, learning how to think with each other, learning how to have hard conversations. I think we just have to be that wherever we go, no matter what people say. We just have to continue to model that wherever we go.
We have to GOTV, right? Get out and vote for in November, seriously, because
Mhm.
to see the most visible display of dumbness would be to put another uneducated, inject bleach into your stomach to kill the virus. Like, I mean, that's what's been represented as,
Yeah.
right, as somebody of that lack of intellect at all can lead the free world. I mean, yes, our students see that. Anyhow, whole nother show. It's the 9 o'clock hour. Look, Vincent, I appreciate that you came on. We can't stop this conversation. We have to keep this conversation going. We need to get Reid on so that he can talk with us too. We need to support him. To our voters and our listeners, we will get Reid on so that we can talk to him about, if we can support him getting into a seat that can help us to start to be able to drive some of these changes. I mean, we need that. And Vincent, we look forward to hearing more about what you're going to continue to do. So thank you for coming on and talking with us tonight about this. This is so important, and God help us November 3rd.
Well, the primary August 6th first.
August 6th, right. I was thinking about the presidential. I was thinking about the president campaign or election, about the leadership of this country and what this will mean for our children, given what you were describing earlier in the show about what they're being subjected to. So we just have to get out and vote and make sure
Up and down the ballot, though, not just the presidential.
Right. Thank you, Erin and Stefani, for being on here again with me tonight. To our listeners, thank you for joining us this evening. Friday is filing deadline, and so we're going to start diving into having more of our candidates coming on with us. Next week, we are starting off with having Representative Melanie Morgan. She is in the Puyallup area. She is running for re-election. She's going to come on and talk to us about some things that she's accomplished while she's in the legislature and what she hopes to accomplish in the next session. And then we're going to continue these conversations like what we did tonight on these systems that we need to have under a microscope. And we as a community decide how we're going to help support what Stefani was saying earlier around voting for them, getting them in is step one, but we've got to continue to support folks, and this platform will be that platform to help support our candidates and the people who are standing for change. So thank you all for joining us this evening, and we look forward to seeing you all next Wednesday evening. Have a good evening, everyone.
Half that up in Saks, I favor black businesses. Assuming I'm rooting for everybody that's black. Yeah. Yeah. Assuming I'm rooting for everybody that's black. Yo.